to Mornings with Planning, a webinar series hosted the first Wednesday of every month, where the Lexington Division of Planning discusses new ways to reconnect, reimagine, and respond in a new reality. These webinars will be held via Zoom and on Lex TV, and is also being recorded for later viewing on imaginelexington.com, as well as at 1 o'clock this Saturday on Lex TV. This webinar is eligible for AICP credit as well for those of you who are interested in that. So my name is Chris Woodall. I'm the manager of long range planning for the city of Lexington. And a couple of months ago, Libby Jefferson, a member of our staff, approached me about doing a Mornings with Planning webinar tackling issues of systemic injustice in the urban planning realm. Now, in doing this, she recounted her own personal experiences about what it means to be a person of color in this day and age, continuing to fight for freedoms that many of us take for granted. So she presented a very moving proposal that has led to this wonderful panel that we have with us today. Here in long range planning, we're responsible for the comprehensive plan, or Imagine Lexington, that looks 20 years into the future about how we want to grow and develop as a city. We tackle issues of housing, transportation, traffic, the environment, and a whole lot more. But for the first time in 2018, we included equity as a key and explicit pillar of that plan. Knowing that concept needs to be a component of everything that we do. So viewing our processes, regulations, and development patterns through that lens is vital to avoiding any unintended consequences as we grow and develop, and righting any intended consequences that have been pervasive in the field of urban planning over the years. So we will continue to do this, especially as we work on future planning efforts and updates to our comprehensive plan. We're very grateful to each of our panelists for the insight that they're going to provide for this conversation, and especially grateful for our guest moderator, Lisa Higgins-Hord, who will facilitate this important conversation and allow us here in planning to just sort of take a step back and listen. So Lisa is currently serving a dual role with the University of Kentucky in the city of Lexington. At UK, she's the Assistant Vice President for Community Engagement and serves as the Strategic Implementation Coordinator for the City of Lexington. In her duties with the city, she's responsible for creating a plan for the recommendations set forth by the Racial Justice and Equity Commission. In her role at UK, she develops, implements, and assesses significant community-based projects that create robust partnerships between the university, community, faculty, students, and staff, and local, state, and regional constituencies. The responsibilities within the University Community Engagement Department include AmeriCorps, VISTA program, and the Office of Lifelong Learning. In addition to all that, she's also a former councilwoman for District 6 in Lexington, Kentucky, and is also active in many state and local activities. So, needless to say, she's very highly qualified to help facilitate this conversation for us today, and we're incredibly grateful for her willingness to do that. So with that, as our usual moderator, Lauren Weaver, would say, kick back with your morning coffee or tea, and let's begin the conversation. Lisa, I'll turn it over to you, and we'll enjoy the conversation. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to raise my glass of, or my bottle of water here to you. So thank you, Chris. And as Chris Woodall explained, I'll be serving as your moderator for today's conversation. Welcome everyone to Mornings with Planning, Equity in Planning. And before we begin our conversation, I'd like to take this time to introduce our 4 panelists. And panelists, thank you for joining us this morning. I will begin with a brief overview of your roles within your varied positions. I'll allow time after I give that brief intro from your bio for you to add anything else that you feel is important for the audience to know about you today. I would also like for you during that time to give us a short answer, sort of like an icebreaker question, to the following questions at that time. And the question is, where is the one space outside of your home where you feel the most comfortable and the most yourself? And where is the one place where you see the best example of diversity? I'll read those again after I read your bio, just so that you can have a good understanding of, and remember that. So I promise to be a neutral convener and balance the conversation with questions to support the overall goals of the long range planning team. So let's begin with the bios. And first up, We're going to, our first panelist is Honorable 1st District Council Member James Brown, and he is a native Lexingtonian. James is currently a full-time real estate professional selling both residential and commercial property for United Real Estate. James is extremely passionate about service to neighborhoods and the local school system. He has served as the president of the Radcliffe Marlboro Neighborhood Association and helped initiate several neighborhood programs. In his capacity as council member, James currently serves as the chair of the Planning and Public Safety Committee, Corridors Commission, and Task Force on Neighbors in Transition. He has a seat on the Affordable Housing Governing Board and the Infill and Redevelopment Steering Committee. Welcome, Councilmember James Brown. And at this time, I'll give you the opportunity to answer my questions that I just read off, and also if there's anything else that you'd like us to know about who you are.
Thank you, Lisa. To answer your first question, probably the most comfortable place outside of my home that I know is probably my mama's couch. When I go over to my mother's house and sit on her couch, I just kind of relax, and I always find myself falling asleep. And she says it's because I feel safe, secure, and she knows that she's going to take care of me. So that's probably the most comfortable place. And then your second question in regards to diversity, I would say the whole first district. I tell people all the time that the first district is probably one of the most diverse districts in the city. And I think I can experience and feel that in most of the neighborhoods, and diversity on all levels, socioeconomic, racial, ethnic, in every spectrum. So, those are my answers to your question. And I think my bio pretty much lays out kind of the work that I've been doing on council and in the community. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Brown. Our second panelist today is Christine Stanley. Christine is a partner at Prato, I'm going to get this right, Quintaros, Prato, Wood, Boyer, PA law firm, where she works extensively on matters involving healthcare providers. Ms. Stanley is licensed to practice law in the Commonwealth of Kentucky and is admitted in the U.S. District Court for the Eastern and Western Districts of Kentucky, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, and the United States Supreme Court. We consider her a strong local activist who is civically engaged in Lexington. She's on the Rural Land Management Board that oversees purchase development rights and the Civil Justice Reform Commission. She served 4 years on the Fayette Human Rights Commission. And I believe that she's also going to provide us, if she hasn't already, with an ideal link in the chat box. And I think there's also some information in there about each of our speakers as I begin to introduce them. So I think there was something on Councilman Brown as well. So welcome, Christine. And at this time, I'll give you the same opportunity as I gave Councilman Brown.
Sure, thank you so much. So a space outside my home that I feel most comfortable is usually just anywhere with people that I love and that love me. So I could literally be anywhere, but as long as I have, my husband, my family, my closest friends, I feel safe and I feel free. And so that could be anywhere that they are and they're with me. Another place, where the best example of diversity, I think, is my hometown, which is New York City. I was born and raised there, and there are so many different races, ethnicities, and everything there that I've seen nothing like it in my 35 years on this earth. And so I think that is the best example of diversity. And then Lexington, I think that we have some events that can mimic that. When we had Salsa Fridays at Tandy Park, I saw so many people enjoying the music and coming together. And so that is a Lexington example, aside from the melting pot of the entire United States, which is New York City.
Well, thank you, Christine. Our third panelist today is Decca Hussein Wetzel. She is a historic preservationist, an urban planner, and she has an Urban Roots podcast. She is a Somali American urban history scholar, podcaster, and architectural historian living in Ohio. Her scholarly research interests are specific to mid-20th century African-American home life and the history of urban development. She wants to make tangible changes in urban America and be broad-reaching in doing so. She also wants to improve the lives of immigrants like those in her family who have come as refugees from Somaliland. Moreover, she finds that she is actually a first-generation African-American, and she has the ability to see the history of disenfranchisement in America in a unique way, not from personal experiences, but from the lessons in history. And today, I found this interesting in her bio as well. She talks about today, the atrocities of Jim Crow era segregation and displacement practices are seen as problematic, yet they are subtly replicated through the gentrification of urban neighborhoods. She believes that through scholarly writing, journalistic action, and media attention, she firmly believes that we may have a chance to reach an American audience willing to understand that our shared social, political, and cultural history should not be overlooked. Welcome, Decca, and I will give you the same opportunity as the other panelists.
Thank you. Okay, so I guess my answer for both questions are actually in a way the same. As you mentioned, I'm a first generation Somali American Muslim woman. And it really helps me to feel most comfortable when I'm surrounded by other people of other races, classes, and cultures. So the place I feel most comfortable is probably places like London and New York City and Toronto, where there's a lot of different kinds of people, but I also see a lot of Somalis there. So that's always really inviting. And then the place where I feel like I see the best example of diversity is also those cities, New York, Toronto, and London. A lot of reasons are the same as what Christine said, just because, it is a melting pot and there's a lot of different kinds of people, and it is literally the definition of diversity. So those would be my answers.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And last but not least, our final panelist is Chris Nunn. Chris had been an employee at No-Lie CDC since June of 2014, where his role originally was to oversee all design and construction aspects of No-Lie CDC's programs and operations. Chris became No-Lie CDC Executive Director in 2018 and guided the organization opening and growing Julietta Market, a nonprofit, multi-vendor public market aimed to bring opportunities of all kinds to neighbors, entrepreneurs, and visitors from all of Lexington's communities. In June 2021, Chris has stepped back and he has a supporting role at this point as well. And at this point, we have Andrew James, who has taken over as the Executive Director for No-Lie. Chris's experiences in architecture, along with subsequent experiences designing and building his own house in Madison, Wisconsin, as well as more experimental design and construction work done in Santa Elena, Venezuela, combined to inform how he thinks of the built environment as a framework for and representation of the community's aspirations, history, individuality, beauty, and challenges. In his time doing this work, he has come to know through all of his experiences and relationships that all work, no matter how big or small, needs to be intentionally and consciously rooted in and moving toward an ever higher degree of equity. Thank you and for joining us. And Chris, I yield to you to give you the same amount of time.
Thank you so much. I feel most at home a couple of different places. I was thinking about my musical upbringing, and one of the places I feel most comfortable is in front of a piano. And the other place that I would say is just being outside. I feel like being able to be out and be able to wander in nature is something that really makes me feel grounded. And the place where I see the most diversity, I think the North Limestone neighborhood, again, similar to James's plug of the first district, I feel like that neighborhood is a very diverse place, and I really appreciate the lack of homogeneity there. It really, you have, highly educated people living very closely to folks who didn't have the chance to finish high school. So you have elderly, you have young, you have all different income brackets. So I really enjoy that range of experiences and perspectives, because it really makes me feel like we all have a lot to learn from each other. So that those are the places like that where I feel the most at home. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So now we're going to move directly into the questions. I'm not going to waste any time because that's the reason why everyone is here. Before we do that, I want to remind the audience that this is an opportunity for you during this time that I'm asking these questions that have already been submitted to also submit your questions for, I guess, using the Q&A functionality. And at one point, I will be able to cover that content alongside the questions submitted via the registration form. So thank you so much for attending. And again, if you have questions, please send those on to the Q&A. So our first question is actually a three-parter. All my questions are 2 and 3 and 4 parts. So again, if you have any part of this question you want me to repeat, I will do that in the process of this. But also this question I feel like can be directed towards Councilman James Brown, Chris, as well as Decca. And so, however, Christine, if you want to weigh in, please feel free to do so because this is an informal process. So we have been taught for many years that it is a good thing to invest and grow our city. What tips that balance and begins to push neighborhoods into a cycle of displacement and or gentrification? Are there steps we can take to encourage good investment opportunities that are deemed a win-win for everyone? And what have we seen working elsewhere, since Lexington is not alone in this matter? And so whoever wants to answer this first, please feel free to.
I don't mind.
Okay.
Because I've thought about this a lot. And, you know, I think historically disinvestment in cities was ultimately triggered by white flight. And looking back at the phenomenon, we now understand the factors that made it difficult for Black upward mobility. And really in the past, but also on how that affects the present. So today, I think we should find ways to move forward by recognizing these truths and finding ways to reconcile the damages that's been done. And gentrification, I think, is only possible because of the racist mid-century housing practices that allowed our Black population to be displaced, refused mortgages, systematically paid less than white counterparts, and ultimately, plain and simple, the system is really unequal and it needs to be changed. And I know that a lot of people, well, this is an equity in planning, so I think we have ability to have really open conversations about Black and white. But I really do think that the reasons for gentrification now are rooted in history. But then I also think that, you know, in particular within historic preservation, there's a lot that goes on in gentrification. So one thing that's a big part of gentrification development are historic tax credits, which often benefit larger developers. Of course, these properties need to be listed in the National Register of Historic Places first, which is primarily what hinders the ability of historic tax credits to be accessible. But I do think that Kentucky is actually a really great example of taking historic tax credits and making them a little bit better, because the state historic tax credit in Kentucky, it allows for a residential tax credit, which I think is super great because it allows for homeowners to receive the tax credits in rehabilitating their own homes. And this is actually something that I think more states should adopt, and perhaps the city of Lexington could promote the program in an effort to be more, you know, inclusive to homeowners and providing resources. And that's kind of where I go along with, you know, digital media and these things that can be available to people.
If I could, I just wanted to piggyback on that a little bit, because I think that, Decca, what you said is really important for that's been preserved is a very sort of curated history that really supports that white supremacy. And so the things that we have preserved about our history tend to be the big mansions that were owned by white folks. And so I'm really glad that we're starting to hear a lot of the stories. Like if you go to Monticello, you get to hear about not just, you know, the important folks that live there. You know, you don't just learn about Thomas Jefferson, you learn about the folks that worked there and were enslaved there. And I think that that's a great storytelling that I hope Lexington is working toward. I'm really grateful for the placards up and down North Limestone that talk about the history of significant African Americans. But specifically to the question of gentrification, I think knowing that history, reading books like Richard Rothstein's Color of Law, understanding how that white supremacy was woven into every public policy, from deed restrictions to lending laws to the GI Bill to restrictive covenants, all those things prevented African Americans from owning property. And knowing your own history, knowing that places like Castlewood Park, when they were platted in the 20s, had deed restrictions that said that no African Americans could even be on the premises unless they were employed by the white owner. And knowing, that potentially your house is a part of that lineage. I think moving forward, control is always a huge question. And as I've said a number of times, I think that gentrification is most problematic because of who benefits from it. And I think that it would be a very different narrative if people of color, if women, if African Americans, if the folks that have lived there for decades were benefiting from that change, and if it really felt genuinely for them. I think in a lot of cases, the sort of public improvements tend to happen right as the neighborhood is flipping. And so people feel like, oh, they're creating sidewalks now for the white folks that are coming, or they're finally plowing the snow, or they're finally doing this or that. And I think that makes a large portion of our community feel very disenfranchised because they feel like that investment isn't in their interest. It's in the interest of the folks that are coming to change their neighborhood. And so figuring out how to deploy techniques like land trusts, how to really bolster the affordable housing fund, how to really help homeowners stay in their homes, how to help folks understand how to be developers so that they can be the change that's happening in their neighborhood, as opposed to it always being sort of outside predatory folks coming in. I mean, I'm speaking a lot from our experience in North Limestone, but from what I've read, that's pretty universal across this country. So I think those would be some really important strategies to trying to not stop gentrification, because a lot of the improvements and change are really important and necessary to the livability of a place, but really figure out who they're responding to, what it looks like, and who benefits from it.
Lisa, this is James. I appreciate the comments from the other panelists. I think they hit the nail on the head in regards to the historical factors that play, especially the disinvestment piece, whether that was from property owners or local governments. I think it is helping to drive gentrification and displacement. One of the things, some of the factors that we've identified in the neighborhoods in transition is, we see a lot of this displacement and gentrification in neighborhoods that have high minority populations and a low percentage of home ownership. I think there's a certain point when you get to the level of rental property outpacing property owners that are living in those properties. I think you start to see that the numbers tick up in regards to gentrification and displacement. But I think, another factor, and I think this is to Lexington and probably some other places around the country, is when your growth strategy is infill and redevelopment, that adds additional pressure onto some of those downtown and low income neighborhoods that drive investment in redevelopment. So, we have to look at policies at the local level and then also encourage our private sector partners to try to address some of the historical issues that help make it hard to stabilize these neighborhoods. And I think that is in regards to making sure that there are loan opportunities, that there are some financial management resources available. And then also, one of the biggest factors that we see and that we know exists is the inability for families to pass on wealth in regards to land and property. A lot of times those, those opportunities are missed to help stabilize families and neighborhoods, and that's where we're seeing the displacement. And then some of the other successes that I think we're seeing around the country, and we have seen some here locally, but there's opportunity to improve, is the Affordable Housing Fund. It was started here in Lexington a few years ago. We have seen great success out of that program, and the ability of our manager and our partners to leverage that funding. But until we can, and I'm just saying this is one of the ways to address gentrification and displacement, until we get to a place where we have a dedicated funding source and have the ability to grow that fund and create more home ownership opportunities, as well as preserving and creating new rental units. Until we get to that point, it's still going to be a uphill battle in regards to protecting the most vulnerable in the community.
Thank you all for that that conversation, and I think at the end of this, we will actually be circling back around. I believe Chris will, with some points from which you've raised today, which are extremely important around gentrification and displacement. Our next question, I'm actually going to direct this towards Christine Stanley. And Lexington is unique in that it has an established urban service boundary by which growth and density are pushed to the core of Fayette County, and agricultural land is preserved around the edges to focus the cost of infrastructure and encourage smart growth. How do we weigh the need to protect this valuable rural land with the pressure to provide new neighborhoods and affordable housing? What is the rationale behind investing in those rural areas through things like the purchase of development rights program, when there is a proven need for funding of so many programs in our most populated parts of the city? And I think this feeds nicely off of what we've just talked about and our inner city opportunities, and also what's been happening to people and how they've been pushed out. So could you expand upon that, please, Christine?
Sure, absolutely. So my understanding of the urban service boundary, Lexington is unique, but there are approximately, I think, 197 other metropolitan areas that have an urban service boundary. And they do that to prevent urban sprawl. So if you've ever been to a place where there's strip mall after strip mall after strip mall, it's just development, and these kind of just cookie cutter homes everywhere. And so that's my idea of what the urban service boundary protects. It protects kind of established neighborhoods. It forces folks to really focus in on the city. From the research, I think that was done by Fayette Alliance, it's my understanding as well that there are 17,000 acres of land within the urban service boundary that can be developed and redeveloped. And for that alone, I don't think that the urban service boundary needs to be expanded until we've really looked at the opportunity that is currently available to us now. With regards to PDR, I think what Dekwa was talking about earlier about the historic systematic oppression and racism in land, I think that what the commission looked at PDR, I think they're absolutely correct. Systematically and historically, the people who benefited from PDR have been farm owners who've had that land since colonization, right? And so our current role in PDR is actually working with Black Soil, which is a non-profit organization run by Ashley Smith, to really reconnect PDR with Black farm owners and landowners in Kentucky so that they also can receive that benefit, kind of like our historic tax credit going to the residents, not just commercial folks and not just folks who historically have owned the land but not worked the land. And, you know, I think investing in certain organizations that we already have, like Lexington Community Land Trust, I think, is a fantastic organization that we need to put as much funding as possible, because it actually addresses what Chris and James were talking about, which is generational wealth, right? It allows folks to own their home and pass it on for generations without having to combat outside forces. And when I say outside forces, what I mean is during a pandemic, we saw that the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. I mean, it's on every news channel, it's just facts. And so when we have that dichotomy of people not benefiting from outside forces like a pandemic, but actually suffering from those, it's hard for them to reap the benefits of all the things that we're talking about. You know, if they can't even put food on their plate, they're not worried about finding a home ownership grant. They're just trying to make it day by day. And so I think addressing, you know, our resources that we have now, our kind of nonprofits or organizations that are already doing the work, I think is really, really, really important. And also forcing organizations and commissions like the PDR to recognize how they've systematically disenfranchised folks and to right that wrong. And to have that engagement and make sure that all people are being included within an agricultural standpoint. I also find that PDR is really, really important, especially, again, after the pandemic, so much things came to light. You know, I don't know if anyone has tried to order a vehicle or appliances or anything like that. Wood, we depend so much on getting our food and supplies from outside. And so I think that we, over time, you know, right now there's a movement, farm to table, but I think over time we'll see that it's more than a movement, it's a necessity. It's a necessity to have food grown in our own state so that in another pandemic, 10, 20 years from now, we won't have to depend on Utah and Wyoming and Brazil and China and all these other places for our wood, our food, and all of our bare necessities. And so I think investing in our agriculture here in Kentucky, which, you know, we do have good soil here, we do have plenty of land now. We have a bunch under PDR that can be used for working farms. It just can't be used for commercial purposes. And so I think that's also a part of preserving land, is that knowing that that land will be hopefully used to support ourselves. And so we don't have to be dependent on other states or other countries for our resources.
Christine, thank you so much, because I was actually going to do a follow-up question myself on this that really talked about who benefits from the PDR process. And I think you tried to create a balance of knowledge there. Is there anyone else who wants to address this particular question and any of the comments that Christine has stated? No? Okay. Well, we will move on to our next question, and this is a question for the entire panel. So let's go ahead. We hear the term systemic racism a lot when it comes to issues of equity. Numerous examples exist of government efforts in the last century to provide home ownership opportunities to white middle-class families in new suburban communities, while pushing people of color into the urban housing projects or an unending cycle of rentals with no opportunity to grow capital. Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, lays out the many local, state, and federal housing policies that mandated segregation, most notably the creation of the Federal Housing Authority and their refusal to insure mortgages in and near the Black and African American neighborhoods, also known as redlining, as well as the overt racism of the development community through the establishment of racial covenants, such as deed restrictions against people of color. What are some of the policies that have come out of the Mayor's Commission on Racial Justice and Equality or the Task Force on Neighborhoods in Transition that are working to right those wrongs? What can we learn from other places regionally and nationally that are also dealing with these same issues? That was a lot.
Thank you, Lisa. I'll get us started unless Miss. Okay. Yeah, that's a lot to unpack there. So I'll just kind of touch on it and maybe way back in later. I remember early on in the Neighborhoods and Transition Task Force meetings, as we started to look at some of the data in regards to Lexington's neighborhoods that were seeing change and experiencing displacement. And I think Chris was one of the first people that pointed out, if you laid the redlining maps over top of Lexington, it lined up almost exactly with the infill and redevelopment maps and some of the maps that we were looking at in regards to displacement in neighborhoods that were changing. I mean, so it showed that that these systematic racist policies have affected us on a local level. It's not just something that we talk about that's happening in other cities. I mean, you can see it here in Lexington and actually see it play out. So I think one of the first steps is to acknowledge that that Lexington is not immune to this phenomenon, in that you have to take accountability for how it's playing out in real life and every day to some of our families in our community. One of the things that one of the things that's going to take place that has the potential of having a significant impact on Lexington is the new division created by the mayor's office in regards to community. Is it housing and community development? I can't ever remember the name, but just lining up some of these city divisions and departments in regards to resources and holistically thinking about how they approach and address some of these issues. I don't think it's going to be a silver bullet by any means, but I think at the very least, it will be able to connect the dots between folks needing help and services and the services and help that the city provides, being able to get it to the folks that need it the most. We also have implemented some changes in some policies and code enforcement. Code enforcement, what we heard in the task force and what we continue to hear, a lot of folks feel like it's being weaponized against them. And if we can change the way they approach what they do on a day-to-day basis, and also have the ability to connect families to resources in that aspect, I think it could have a significant impact and address some of the systematic problems that exist in our neighborhoods. So I'll stop there and I'll see what other comments some of the other panelists have.
Well, if I could step in, I just have to echo like these, I'm also a big advocate for the creation of digital resources for homeowners and renters with detailed guidance that it might include contacts or where people can get housing assistance, get loans, find affordable housing. And we'd also with that, I suppose, historic tax credits as well, that information. But definitely reviewing zoning codes, that they need to be more equitable and be revised, I think. So I live in Cincinnati and we have so many issues with our zoning, and in particular, single family zoning in, areas that, it's like you don't want to just be able to have single family homes. You want to have larger multifamily homes to be able to provide housing for more people. But there are restrictions against that in a lot of cases. And I actually really want to go back a little bit to let's talk about Cincinnati. So as Lisa mentioned, I have a podcast called Urban Roots. And the first season is something that I started through a Truth and Reconciliation grant from Arts Wave, which is a Cincinnati-based nonprofit. And this kind of goes back to what some of the folks were saying about how, nonprofit groups, need to be held accountable. They need to be taken, but they also, they make a pretty big impact, and they take on a very large role in cities. So I think that sometimes balancing out, where the nonprofit sector can be useful and where the city can also step in to fill in those gaps, because nonprofits have too much, I think, on their shoulders sometimes. So another nonprofit in Cincinnati called Invest in Neighborhoods works with each neighborhood community council. We have 52 neighborhoods in Cincinnati, but not every neighborhood has a community council. But for the most part, they do. So back to Urban Roots, the podcast, the first season is called Lost Voices of Cincinnati. It's a series that tries to expand on the importance of understanding communities, Black communities in Cincinnati, and in particular, because I learned over time that Cincinnati's got this, 52 neighborhoods, but they all feel very divided. So I wanted to find a way for people to know different neighborhoods to hear about some of the minority neighborhoods. So for example, Avondale, that's the latest episode that we just put out. And it's, it's a neighborhood that's really experienced a lot of redlining and blockbusting. And in the episode, we talk to community members about their experiences. And we also talk with professional professors and preservation experts to talk about, what kind of that stuff that Richard Rothstein was talking about in The Color of Law, really getting that policy understanding involved in, what we're talking about. So I just think that, as we grow as a city and we're trying to be more racially just, really listening to people in the community is very important to promote not top-down planning, but bottom-up planning. And really, I think just utilizing, I am really happy to be able to be utilizing podcasting as a means of public history and just getting the word out there for people to know outside of Cincinnati as well, that yes, these things happen. And a lot of cities have experienced this, but I do think that it's really important to kind of dig into, kind of using Cincinnati as a case study, this one specific city. How did this happen? And then now I hope that, we can have, racial equity and committees and stuff that would be able to help alleviate some of the pressures on the Black communities.
I think that storytelling is really important, capturing the history. Decca, I really agree with you that that's a critical part in documenting the communities that have been there, and telling those stories. I think I have seen in our work that so many people feel very seen and heard when their story is documented, and when they're given a chance not to just give a 30-second soundbite or shorter, but to really talk for an hour about their personal experience. They feel very empowered that their story is meaningful and important. The challenge that I see, and we're talking about public policy, but I think that ground up approach, the major hurdle that I see is that for folks where the system has not been in their favor for hundreds of years, getting them to believe that there's going to be some positive impact from them telling their story, from them saying, hey, I want this and not this. And, not always running the calculus of, all right, what's the right answer? What's going to keep me out of harm's way? What's going to, make me be able to continue as long as I can before this all crumbles or gets taken from me. I think that is a huge part of it, having some trust in the system. And I don't have any answers for that. I think that there has to be a track record established, but it's really a huge challenge. You talk about housing and housing first, and we're all on here talking about planning. I think that city planning is one small part, and I think acknowledging planning's role in systemic racism is really important, but also moving forward, understanding how, for example, your planning staff is representative of all the communities in the neighborhood. Demographically, is it representative? Our council members representative? I think that there's so much lack of trust that I encountered in our small little section of the world, doing this work for 7 years, that I realized that you can show up and say whatever you want and say how great it's going to be, but until it actually happens, folks are going to be very reticent to take a chance on you, whether it's public policy, whether it's, getting a loan, whether it's buying a house, whether it's, even standing up at a community meeting and saying, I believe that this is what we should do. So, and I think, so as a member of that Neighborhoods in Transition Task Force, as a member of the Sustainable Growth Task Force, Infill and Redevelopment Committee, I've had the good fortune to be able to share a lot of those stories with those committees and groups. But I think the most important thing from a public policy standpoint is figuring out how to help government be proactive, how to be, whether it's, the Moneyball predictive analytics approach or some other way of understanding where the change is going to happen and positioning folks who otherwise would get displaced to be in control, position them to have the tools, to have the resources so that they can be not an afterthought, but the foundation of that change. I think it's going to happen in Cardinal Valley. It's going to happen in Winburn. It's already happening in the East End. It's already happening in North, the North End, North Limestone. And I think just understanding where those areas are going to be and taking steps proactively to try to position neighbors, especially longtime residents, to be beneficiaries of that change as opposed to collateral damage of that change.
I wanted to add, looking at the Mayor's Commission for Racial Justice and Equity report, just on the housing section, the housing planning section, I found all of those recommendations to be rooted in equity, which is awesome. I think those things need to be done. But I do think that those recommendations don't address systemic barriers. And I think until those systemic barriers are removed, we're continually going to have to make recommendations on how to quote unquote fix the issue. And so I'm going to say some examples of what to do to remove a systemic barrier may be outside of the hands of our city. It may come from a state level, but from a policy level, the conversation needs to be around literally removing the walls that are put in front of folks that are preventing them from, buying a home in 2021, $50,000 above asking price. And some of that is increasing the minimum wage, which has not moved in accordance with our, price of gas. Stop incarcerating Hispanic and Black men at an alarming rate for petty drug offenses. We have a number of single women, single parent, children without their fathers. It's because, a lot of them are in jail for ridiculous offenses. Reinstating felony rights. So I've had this conversation many, many times with many people who do not agree with me on this, but my thought process is that if our society has, thought of these rules for felons, and they serve their time, whatever time that is, that person no longer has rebirth. They paid for whatever they did. When they are back into society, they should have the same rights that they had prior to. And I think SNAP benefits last week, they said that being a felon no longer prevents you from getting SNAP benefits. I mean, if we can think about that you said that this person who did X did their time, now is trying to get back on their feet and can't get food. That is a punishment that far exceeds what they've already served their time for. And I think that's going to be really, really important in kind of reintegrating folks back into our community and making them feel like they are part of this community. I know it feels like they're the other, but they are our neighbors' kids. They are our neighbors' parents and grandparents. They are people that are literally the fabric of this community because, you know, not for nothing, their jobs, you know, tend to be at the gas station. They're helping you with your groceries. They're packing your vegetables, whether you like it or not. Those are the jobs that they are finding. And so they are part of this community and they should be felt that way, and they should be able to grow with us. Smart growth, equitable growth is great, but not just for the people that can benefit from these band-aids, right? There are a number of people that will, you know, excel and exceed just from the recommendations, but that still leaves a number of people behind because the actual barrier has not been removed. And so the other thing was I know is, again, maybe outside the scope of our city, but it's also healthcare. I do a lot of healthcare, and it's one of those things that,
Christine,
yes.
before you, my little
Yes.
bell just went off. That means
Sorry, I am
we've
on a
got
time
about
right now.
3 minutes left for our entire program. And I know that we could continue to go on and on and on about this, but can we just add one more question in here from our audience? We do have a question, and we could actually spend all day on that question that I read to everyone. And I'm glad I put it towards the end because I think we would still be on that same question had I read that one first. But if there's anything else that you want to wrap this up with really quickly, I'm going to go to this next question.
No, just healthcare, period.
Okay. Okay. So urban tree canopy is inequitable in many cities. Is this also an issue in Lexington? And if so, is this moment of one-time federal funding a good opportunity for investment in sustainable, equitable development of this asset? And if we don't have anyone that has an answer to this, we can continue going. But I wanted to give us that fair opportunity to ask that question.
I did want to say that I think the environment is a really important thing that we need to talk about in terms of equity, not just tree canopy, but I think, you know, with climate change and what's going to be a climate crisis for our children, I think figuring out how to make that equitable as that becomes a bigger portion of our economy, and even positioning those disenfranchised folks that Christine was talking about. I think there's a lot of ways that those things can all be brought together to be beneficial.
And I'll add real brief as a colleague of the late great Jake Gibbs, and also on his tree canopy commission. There's a lot of emphasis on providing and increasing the tree canopy in the 1st and 2nd district, and I know those efforts are ongoing. I just had a meeting last week at a site in the East End neighborhood where the opportunity exists to increase the tree canopy and all the benefits that it provides. So I think there's an opportunity to do something now to address that. Thank you.
Yeah, and I agree. I think the tree canopy needs to be done. We need to increase it as much as possible. There was an article or research that was done that in like low income areas, there isn't enough tree canopy, so that increases their utility bills. And so again, it's just perpetuating kind of hardships on folks in those areas. So yeah, tree canopy.
Okay. Well, I know that I think we are almost out of time, and if Chris allows me to ask one more question, I will do so, but I'm assuming we started just a little bit under our time or over our time. So I have several other questions that I wanted to ask you all, but we will end on this question here. And just really quickly, if everyone could give me information, is there any one thing the city could do in the next 5 years to bridge the gap in equitable planning for the growth of Lexington? And what would you think that would be? We may only be able to get one person in here.
I mean, I could do it pretty quickly. because I already said it, promoting bottom-up planning and ensuring people have the ability to speak in the community, particularly minority communities. People need to be able to have a say in what happens to their neighborhoods. And it requires a level of community engagement that will require extensive outreach, public participation, and active listening.
Thank you very much.
I'll jump on that bandwagon too, Lisa, if I can.
Okay, sure, please.
I agree completely. I think the ground up, bottom up engagement and input into the process, and I think Lexington has that opportunity coming up with the next comprehensive planning process. I think our planning department does a great job of reaching out and engaging the community through surveys and input opportunities. But I think everybody has to get involved with this next comprehensive plan and have their voices heard and their input gathered in regards to how we move forward as a city with our growth challenges. Thank you.
I think that's a perfect way for us to end this. And Chris, I don't know, can we add one more person in, or will we get cut off in the middle of this? I'm not sure.
If somebody else would like to chime in, that would be just fine.
Okay, I think Christine wanted to.
Yeah, I just have one thing. Something that Chris said earlier, I think bottom up is great and listening to the stories, but promoting the trust is the action. So you can't just listen and not follow through. I think part of this conversation is amazing, and then having the action plan and making it happen is also necessary.
It's brilliant. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much. Chris, I am going to turn this back over to you, and thank you all again so much for joining us this morning.
All right, thank you, Lisa. Yeah, that was a perfect segue and conclusion for us as we kind of move into what we're going to do next. But I want to first encourage our audience to start quickly clicking all the links you can, because as soon as we're done here, all those will disappear. So Lauren's done an excellent job of putting those links together for some information that's relevant to our conversation. And certainly this was, there was a lot to unpack here. And as Christine and many of our other panelists mentioned, this is a very multifaceted challenge. And it's a lot for us to consider here in long range planning as we're considering kind of our real implications of our development patterns as we move forward. And Decca and Chris mentioned at the outset, the issues of displacement and gentrification are rooted in history through redlining and restricted covenants and zoning codes and all sorts of problems. And so as we start to address this historic disinvestment, I think we do need to consider who's going to be benefiting from the new investment as we continue to grow as a city. So a lot of stuff for us here to consider, because we need to not only understand our history so that we don't repeat it, but also that we can continue to repair some of these lingering issues that hang out there too. So this is a conversation that we'll continue to revisit. As Councilmember Brown mentioned, as we develop the next comprehensive plan, certainly as we implement this existing comprehensive plan, this was an important conversation for us that we'll go back and reference. And certainly we hope to have more conversations like it. And as Decca mentioned, the bottom up, the listening is incredibly important. And that's what we hoped for. And that's what we got here was a great listening experience for us as a planning staff to be able to listen to some of folks who have intimate knowledge of this subject. And we hope to have more of these individual stories to understand how people experience the city so we can learn and grow in a positive way here. So I know there are probably some questions out there that didn't go answered live. I apologize for that, but I do want to encourage everyone to reach out to us at imagine@lexingtonky.gov, and we'll respond to those questions. We'll get you in touch with people that might be able to answer them. If we can't, we'll find answers for you. Again, if you're seeking AICP credits, the session is eligible. And I really want to conclude by saying thank you to our moderator, Lisa Higgins-Hord, and then all of our panelists, Councilmember James Brown, Christine Stanley, Chris Nunn, and Decca Hussein Wetzel. Also want to thank our coordinator, Samantha Castro, for getting this put together. And our live Q&A support is Lauren Weaver, and I'm doing my very poor Lauren Weaver impression today. She's our normal moderator. Our technical support is Libby Jefferson, who originally proposed this topic for this important conversation. So thank you to Libby. Chris Edwards with Lex TV, and then of course, everybody who tuned in to listen. Thank you so much for doing that. So the Mornings with Planning webinar series will continue to discuss new ways to reconnect, reimagine, and respond in a new reality. And we want to hear from you. What topics should we discuss as we move Lexington forward together? Email us at imagine@lexingtonky.gov to let us know. We'll be back on the first Wednesday of next month, which will be August 4th. So for more information on future sessions, to access the recording from this webinar, and to learn more about planning in Lexington, please visit imaginelexington.com or lexingtonky.gov/planning, and follow us on social media. Thank you all for spending your morning with us, and we'll see you next time.